And my first slide here is the first page of a very influential contribution published by Schrödinger, he of the uncertainty principle, a physicist who dabbled in biology in his later life and published a book, this book here, in 1944. It's the 75th anniversary of this book, based on lectures he gave in Dublin in 1943. He was particularly concerned with how living organisms maintained order. As a physicist, he was particularly interested in the second law of thermodynamics, and he wanted to know how life could escape the decay into chaos that is, of course, enshrined in that particular law, and how to do it across generations. This is two quotes I've taken from that 1944 book, which the first there, an organism's astonishing gift of controlling a stream of order on itself and thus escaping the decay into atomic chaos. The second law, as I just said. He's also interested in how this order displays the power of maintaining itself and producing orderly events. And finally, Crick himself postulated what he called the central dogma of molecular biology, where the information, which I shall talk about more, stored in DNA is transcribed into another nucleic acid, RNA, and then translated into protein. And that's going to form a central part of what I shall say. This is the basis of Schrödinger's code script. It explains the permanence of heredity because it's replicated every time a cell and therefore an organism divides. So living organisms, and now we have to think about principles, are based, at least on Earth, on nucleic acids. Nucleic acids encode information, and they can be precisely copied because of pairing between bases that make them up. And again, this discussion has introduced two new concepts that I want to introduce to you. The first is chemistry. The chemical aspects of living organisms are critical for understanding life. The second concept is the importance of information encoded in those molecules. And these are the two ideas I'm going to discuss next. And I'm going to start with life as chemistry. Basically, life is based on chemistry and physics. It's the mechanistic basis of life. I have to stress that because for many years, actually a couple of thousand years, starting with Aristotle, scientists thought that the complexity of life was so great that it could not be explained by the laws of chemistry and physics. They proposed vitalism, that there were vital laws that weren't based on chemistry and physics, that were necessary to explain that complexity. It took work by French chemists to overturn this. Initially Lavoisier, and then it was taken over by Pasteur, the famous Louis Pasteur, who was working on an applied project on why sugar beet fermentation went wrong, came to the conclusion that it was all to do with chemical products being made during fermentation, and came to the following conclusion, that fermentation was a physiological act yielding chemical products for the cell. And then he made a general conclusion. Chemical reactions are an expression of the life of the cell. In other words, he was postulating if we want to understand life, we have to understand the chemistry that goes on in life. I can summarize that in a different way, which is that living cells, back to cells again, can be considered as a chemical machine. Complex chemical machine, including also physical processes as well. However, it is a very special sort of chemistry that we see in living cells. On this planet, this chemistry is based on carbon. Carbon is made inside stars. It's the 14th most common element in the universe. we are basically based on stars. Now, what's important is that each carbon atom can form 4 chemical bonds, linking it to other atoms. And it can use 2 of those bonds to link to other carbon atoms to make up chains, a sort of polymer. You can see that here. There's a backbone of carbon makes up a linear polymer. But then it has 2 free bonds, which can form bonds with other atoms, such as oxygen, hydrogen, carbon itself. And this means that there's a variety of different chemistries that can be put on top of this basic polypeptide chain. And that's because it's made of chain of amino acids, which are of carbon and connected by nitrogen. And there's 20 different amino acids that are used by life, and they have different chemical characteristics. Some of them are bulky, some of them are small, some of them are acidic, some of them are basic, that is, they have negative or positive charges. Some of them like water, some of them don't like water. And all of this can lead to a wide variety of chemical properties. And because you can build up extremely long carbon chains, maybe thousands long, then you can produce very complex structures, which can also fold up into a 3-dimensional structure. Now, there's a lot going on here that is really important to emphasize, because what we see here is starting off with a simple carbon polymer made up of different amino acids. You can make elaborate molecular structures with a variety of different chemistries that can be put there that leads to a huge variety of chemical machines. And these are the basic workhorse of life. These make up the enzymes that change other chemicals into different chemicals. They can build up molecules, they can break down molecules. That's as part of metabolism, which is critical for the functioning of life. And these chemical machines are so efficient that they can operate in very gentle conditions. We sometimes try and mimic it in rather more extreme conditions in, for example, industrial chemical plants, where we have high temperatures and high pressures and extreme conditions. But these can operate in very gentle conditions. Why is that important? It's important because it means that within a cell, a tiny cell, many hundreds, in fact thousands, of chemical reactions can be occurring in a very restricted space, because you're not having to have high temperatures or pressures. You can have very gentle conditions. However, these reactions can only occur if there's different chemical microenvironments. So if we look at a metabolic map here, each of those dots on this map, but all these dots are different chemical reactions, and they're all occurring simultaneously in the tiny structure of the cell. And if you now look at a cell, you'll see it's extremely complex. But what I want to try and convince you is that actually this complexity represents the microcompartments of different chemistries that are occurring on in the cells. It's not how it's normally explained. And that's brought about by the proteins themselves with different folds making little compartments where certain chemistry can go on, assembly of those enzymes, which result in components being passed and molecules being passed from one enzyme to another, different membrane components, compartments, as you see here in this cell, and even different colloidal structures, what we now call phase separations. So when you look at the complexity of the cell, I want you to imagine it as many hundreds, in fact thousands, of little chemical microenvironments carrying out specific chemical reactions adjacent to each other, connected to each other, but separate. And that is needed to generate the chemical complexity of life. Now, there's a consequence of this, is that this intricate spatial organization of the cell, of these different chemistries, must be able to communicate across the cell. Because if they're not communicating with each other, you can't get order. So you need compartmentation and separation, but you need also communication. What contributes to that, and that comes from physics, is that there is a skeleton within the cell made up of different, like tramways or railway tracks, connecting different parts of the cell. And there's little motors working their way through the cell, transporting different components from one place of the cell to other places in the cell. And all of these need energy, and in fact, to maintain the cell needs energy. And there's little batteries in the cell as well, like our chemical batteries. Charged hydrogen atoms can accumulate behind some of these membranes and act as batteries. Transferred through the membrane, the protons, charged atoms, and that produces high-energy chemical bombs, which are stored for use elsewhere. Communication, then, is critical. And communication between all these components is dependent upon information and the transfer of information. And that's my next great idea in biology that I want to explain to you as the basis of life. And that is that biological entities are complex systems, and that information management is crucial to understanding how they work. It won't surprise you that this idea has grown a lot of prominence in the age of computing, because obviously information and the management of information is critical in computing. And so there was much discussion of this from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s onwards. But it may surprise you to learn that the idea that life is a complex system with these properties has its origins with the philosopher Kant, Immanuel Kant, around 1800. I found this a big surprise. He wrote a book on moral philosophy, and for some reason got completely distracted into talking about the complexity of life in talking about moral philosophy. In fact, although biology can be described in terms of chemistry, as I've just done, it often only makes sense biologically when that description is translated into the management of information. That sounds a bit abstract, but it's important that you get this for understanding life. And there's two examples I want to use to illustrate that and why it's important. And the first is to go back to DNA. Now, I've already explained that DNA is made of DNA, of course, but is the hereditary material. It encodes information. Implicit in Mendel, by the way, was information. Schrödinger used the word code script, but it only made sense back in 1865 if you saw it that way. Now, the double helix of DNA, and you see it here being copied, and because of the DNA is like a ladder of bases. There's 4 different bases, and base G will bind with base C, and base A will bind with base T, so that if you pull that apart, you can get a perfect copy. It's a beautiful thing. And I want you to note that those bases are all on the inside of the polymer. They're sort of protected there, and that's going to be important in a moment. Now, as I said, we can describe it, as I just did, in terms of chemistry, but it makes sense biologically when you recognize that actually it's a digital information storage device. I mean, that's what we're looking at here, a digital information storage device. Now, there's more to it than just that, because it's organized as a linear script. Now, we often, nearly always, order information as linear scripts. Think of reading a sentence. It's a linear script. Think of listening to me talk to you. They are linear scripts. Think of computer code. It's a linear script. Think of a polymer. It's a linear script. It is no accident that life is built on a polymer, because it is the perfect way of storing information, which is critical for biology. It's critical for information storage.